Right now, we are using computational languages or programming languages in order to communicate with a computer to develop software. And basically, what we do is to develop artificial languages to communicate with the computer.
नमस्कार विश्व शांति
Salve.
Hello from the children of planet Earth.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. I think for our guests, this is going to be a special interview. If you could maybe start off with just telling us sort of your name and what you do.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm Anamaria Berea, and I'm an associate professor of computational and data sciences at George Mason University. And I have a wide range of interests from computational sciences to astrobiology, but I am mostly focused on researching and understanding emergence of communication in our living systems on planet Earth. Basically, how did we start to communicate from cells all the way to humans and societies, and how can we extend that into artificial intelligence?
So some of the astrobiologists that I've spoken to have said that, information or the transfer of information is one of the tenets that we consider something to be maybe living or non-living, is that it's able to transfer information. Is that correct? Or
Mm-hmm. Well, information, there is actually a philosophical debate whether information exists outside the living system or not. If we have a purely physical system, yes, it has information, but is it real information if there is no perceptor that actually interprets that information, right? So there is a philosophical debate here. But definitely when it comes to information, it lays out in very different patterns in living systems versus non-living systems. And we know that from many studies in complex systems, in information theory, in astrobiology, some of the researchers have looked into that. So it's quite interesting to understand what exactly is and how exactly does information organize and self-organize itself in a living system versus a non-living system.
Fantastic.
We don't know.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know exactly how that happens, but there are researchers that are looking into that right now.
Sure. What is and I'm asking this because I really do not know. So like the super basic, what is the Shannon theory of information?
So Claude Shannon was one of the first researchers that laid down a theory of information. He published a paper in the 40s where he basically even coined the terms of bits for information, and also he coined the measurement of entropy for information. And that paper has been foundational for not just computational sciences and computer sciences, but also for our understanding of human languages, or our understanding of animal calls and animal signaling. So he laid down basically the idea of how do we quantify information, and how do we interpret it, and how can we transfer that information from a human to a computer, and then from a computer to another computer.
Fascinating. Is the way that we currently look at computing, just in terms of the models, and I know that I'm not going to get this correct, but in terms of the way that we're computing, it's quite a linear process, and it's not the way sort of a biological process would disseminate information. Is that correct?
So right now we are using computational languages or programming languages in order to communicate with a computer to develop software. And basically what we do is to develop artificial languages to communicate with the computer. The way we have developed those are based on mathematics and the theory of computation, and again on information theory. They did not emerge organically, like you were saying, and like it has happened in living complex systems. So that's where the difference between information in complex systems versus information in computers, where it arises. But that's not to say that with the emergence of artificial intelligence right now, that we won't have at some point meta algorithms that will self-organize and then emerge into a new language that as humans we won't be able to understand and interpret. So getting to that self-organization and organic growth of a language, so far it has been only for us, right? Only for humans. That's how human languages emerged. For computers, it's still us that are designing those languages. And they are very structured, and they are quite different than the human languages. For example, a human language is highly embedded in culture, and they co-evolve with the culture, and they change, right? So the English that was spoken during Shakespeare time is very different than the English that we speak now, and the English that the British people are speaking is very different than the English that us, the Americans, are speaking, right? So it's highly embedded in culture, and it co-evolves with our culture and with us. Computer languages, they started with us designing them, but in a sense, they have also co-evolved with the technology. It's just that it's still us that directs the way these computer languages and the meta languages that we are using for designing computer languages, in the way that they actually co-evolved with the technology. When they will be completely self-autonomous, which again it might be possible with the advancement of the artificial intelligence, then we might witness the emergence of a completely new artificial intelligence language that we won't be able to comprehend.
In terms of sort of, if this happens, if we get to the place where we've designed an artificial intelligence that is essentially designing their own language, is there a sentience, do you think, in that? Back to a philosophical question.
That's an entirely different question about what is consciousness, what is awareness, what is sentience. And at the end of the day, is even how we define intelligence. So we don't have a bulletproof and very nailed down definition for what intelligence is, because we are still struggling with that concept. Is it that it's just us humans who are intelligent? Is it that maybe other species might be intelligent as well, right? Let's say, what about the apes? What about the dolphins? What about dogs, right? So we don't have a very good definition about what intelligence is. So by extension, again, when we go into the field of artificial intelligence, is when do we say that a specific algorithm will gain that sentience or that intelligence that is more akin to humans? Theoretically, there has been, and historically, there has been developed the idea of the Turing test, right? And it was actually Alan Turing who laid out this. It's a conceptual test. Basically, when does an algorithm pass as human, as being human? And if that passes as being human, can we consider that algorithm or that robot or whatever is that sentient, and is that like us, right? So, but this again is indeed another major philosophical debate. So.
I mean, also on the other side as well is, where does life start? Not in terms of like, where does it begin, but where do we define life and living and non-living? And, I was initially surprised to hear that like viruses, there's certain parts of the scientific community that would see viruses as non-living, the other parts that would see viruses as living. And, there isn't sort of this clear definition about what is alive, what is not alive.
That's right. So we don't have good definitions for life and for the origin of life, and that's one of the one of the major questions for astrobiology as well, right? Because if you are looking for life on other planets, you have to have a good definition about what is life and what exactly you are looking for, right? And you're right there. There are still debates with respect to RNAs, right? Are they living systems or not? And all these debates about intelligence and life and all these big major concepts, right, that we are struggling with, show us basically how complex life is and how we don't have strict boundaries, right? When moving from, let's say, from one species to another, or from a cell to an organ and to an organism. And this brings again this idea of a complex system, which you cannot really divide into exact parts like you can with a car, right? You take a car apart in its very minute components, and then you can put it back together. If you take a human apart, you cannot really put it back together and get the human again,
I mean,
right?
it makes me think a bit about entropy though, and sort of how essentially we're going in one direction with time and entropy to a fairly basic universe, if that ever happens. But are living systems then sort of a move against entropy in some ways? We're collecting information, or we're collecting sort of we're collecting complexity in some ways.
Yeah, so entropy originally, entropy comes from thermodynamics. It's a concept from physics, which measures the level of organization or disorganization in a system. And it was borrowed from physics to information theory. You were mentioning Claude Shannon, right? So, which again, when we are looking at entropy from the informational point of view, it's the same. We are calculating the degree of organization or disorganization of information in that system. For example, in human languages, entropy is usually calculated to be around level 4. What does 4 mean, right? It's on which scale? But we know that the higher this number is, then we have a more disorganized language. The lower this number is, then we have a more organized language. When it comes to living systems, we know that living systems in general, they have a very efficient way of organizing information. So whether we are talking just about a simple cell or a human, information in ourselves, either from the biological perspective or from the chemical perspective, or from the physical perspective, we know it's highly organized. And by extension, it gets highly organized into our cultures and then into our technologies. And again, when we break these systems apart, then just like you were saying, we have a high degree of entropy, we have disorganization, and we cannot put the system back together.
How does a PhD in economics sort of feed into your research in other areas, in biological systems?
Economics itself as a field is a great way to understand theoretically counterintuitive thinking. I actually highly recommend for all students from any field to take at least one course in economics. Economics is very different from the other physical sciences like physics, like chemistry, like biology, because in essence, economics studies human behavior. But it studies human behavior not from the psychological perspective, but more from the perspective of incentives and rewards, and more from the perspective of the interactions between humans, between us humans, and by extension, between different levels of organizations between humans, which can be firms, which can be NGOs, which can be countries, which can be societies, right? So at different levels of organization between humans and the complex relationships between us and other entities. Economics itself gives us a very good glimpse into how unpredictable human behavior is, how heterogeneous are human preferences, And basically, if humans don't behave like neutrons and electrons, then how can we model them? How can we identify patterns? And how can we predict what's going to happen in the future? From the science of science perspective, and then from the philosophy of science perspective, economics is a great way to train your thinking into some really interesting counterintuitive logic.
Do you think that there is intelligent life in the galaxy outside of us?
I think it's possible. I think it's possible. I think the chances are very small. And it's not my opinion. There have been quite a few very good papers that have been published lately that were doing simulation studies, some of them based on the Drake equation, some of them based on purely exogenous parameters that we think with respect to the length of civilization and about the habitability of the different exoplanets and so many other parameters. And all these simulations from different perspectives, they basically show us that yes, the probability is not zero, but it's not very high either. And it's more likely that we might find microbial life, not exactly intelligent life, and the probability for that is higher than for intelligent life.
Yeah. It also makes me sort of think about, what if we're finding microbial life in different places, what is that shift that turns, microbial life into us, into this sort of chain reaction of getting here, talking to somebody in Washington DC from Johannesburg.
Yeah, I mean, what does it take for those microbes to get into an intelligent life form? However, again, we might define intelligence, right? Or at least into a life form that can build technology that can go farther into space and that can communicate farther. There are many ideas and hypotheses circulated here as well. So there are other. So when it comes to the idea, is there other intelligent life in our galaxy or in the universe? Pretty much everyone says yes. It's just that the one is the probability might be low. The second one is it contemporary with us? Was it that it existed before us, or are we among the first ones, and then there will be subsequent other intelligent life forms and civilizations there? So this is something to consider as well, not just the space and where exactly they are, but are they actually contemporary with us? And if they are they have they developed technology? Can they communicate with us? Can we communicate with them? Are we willing to communicate? Because we might there might be a civilization that they might say, this is too risky, let's keep a low profile, right? Or that might be an intelligent civilization that would have absolutely no interest in developing technology like we did. So there are many factors that we need to consider. In general, when we are thinking, are we alone? We want to find someone who is kind of like us, right? And it's has good wills, right? And we just want to shake hands and start learning alien languages, and they start learning human languages, and that we expand, kind of like in the E.T. movie, right? But we we don't know, right? We don't know exactly if that is the case. Another idea that is that has gotten more and more traction lately is the idea that we shouldn't think only in the biological terms, because biology again is contextual. It's highly embedded in the in the environment, whether that environment is the habitability of the planet and the solar system. But if that biology has developed technology and therefore subsequently artificial intelligence that can last throughout centuries and even millennia, then it's more likely to have AI meeting AI. And it's more likely when AI meets AI that it's more likely to also be able to communicate if there is an incentive for that as well, which again might be not in the realm of the realm of how these algorithms will develop in the future.
If you had the opportunity, what would you like to know from another intelligent life?
I think the best way to know another life form is to live with them, right? So I would actually like to live and experience life with them for a temporary time, right? For a brief period of time. Since I am so passionate about languages, I would definitely want to know about the development of the languages and the way they would communicate. And yeah, I mean, and the best way to learn that and to do that is to actually completely interact with that and be immersed, in their culture.
What is neuron mirroring? What is the thinking behind that?
So in human communication, we have language now, right? But we didn't always have language, and the idea here is that because we have the same anatomy and physiology, even if I have never met you before, if I point towards something and I say book, you will understand it because of the mirroring neurons that we have. So you will, I say book, book, book. You will start saying book, 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 and that's how we learn concepts. Or pointing towards myself, you will understand that when I point towards myself, that it's self-referential. And that's because our brains basically have the same anatomy and the same physiology. Um, and but again, with another species, that's not how we learn and how we do it. So, and we have that example with the apes and the dolphins. It's much more easier. So it's much easier to teach apes the sign language, which has been done, right? Because their brains are closer and similar to ours. It's not the same to teach dolphins. So we can't really teach dolphins the same way that we teach apes the sign language. Also because the anatomy itself is different. They don't have limbs like we have, and digits. Although their brain capacity is much higher actually than ours. So, so this is this hypothesis actually comes from anthropology, and they are basically saying there was a study at the Max Planck Institute where they are saying that human communication basically started by pointing, and because we can point with our fingers, that's how we started to communicate.
Do you think it's good to sort of collect the world's languages and if we have the space, just give all of the languages to?
I don't, because human languages, no matter how varied and different they are, they have evolved in a similar way. And like I said, it's very embedded in our culture. So I would sample from human languages, but I would also sample from the audio calls from other animal species. So I would have different samples for different types of communication throughout our human civilization. And we have we are mostly referring to human languages and maybe to visual and audio communication because that's how we communicate. But other species, they communicate through electromagnetism, or they communicate through electrical signals that we are not capable of, or chemical signals that we are not capable of understanding. So speaking about meaning, right? We are not capable to receive that or to even interpret that. But within the species itself, that's what makes a meaningful communication for them. So in terms of the golden record, I would sample across different species, different ways of communication. Either we are talking about different means and ways of communicating, or different just memes or bits and pieces of communication itself, right? Whether it's whistling, or whether it's a visual way, or whether it's an electric way, or an electromagnetic way, or a chemical way. So
sort of something like maths or science. I think there's two questions here. If math and science, or maths and sort of what we know about the physical world in terms of, the elements, and if those are all the same in different places, is there a way for us to communicate on that level that would be sort of that bridge of communication, do you think?
that's a good question. Many people have asked, why don't we use just math? Because mathematics seems to be a universal language, and that we can use across. We might be able to use across and communicate with another intelligent species. Because if we invented math, then they would have invented math as well. Because we can describe the laws of the universe in mathematical terms. That's actually not true. Mathematics is not a universal language. We know that because we know that there are human species currently still living, let's say, in the Amazon forest, that have not developed any quantitative concept at all. So they don't understand the concept of quantity. They understand one or many. They don't understand two or three, and so on. So it's not necessarily true that mathematics is a universal language. Besides, if mathematics was a universal language, then we would be able to communicate with other species on Earth as well, like the dolphins, or like the dogs, right, that are so much closer to us. And out of these, we can say that probably the only other species that we have developed close communication with is probably the dogs, that we can communicate the best with. But they don't understand mathematics either. Why can we communicate better with dogs? Because they have lived with us, and they have communicated with us for so many thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years, and they have adapted to us, right? That there are so many different species of dogs now, and they have adapted to basically living and co-evolving with us. So again, that comes back to the idea that even for other species, they need to be highly embedded somehow into their environment and into their culture, so that they can understand each other. It would be ideal, indeed, if another civilization would develop the same kind of mathematics that we did. And then we can communicate with each other. But if that's true, then by extension, our AI algorithms would be able to communicate with their AI algorithms as well. Because from mathematics and computation to artificial intelligence, there are only a few steps in evolutionary terms, right? But we don't know if that's exactly the evolutionary path that is going to be for other species. So it's a very, very tricky idea. How can we find those universal patterns of communication, and do they even exist? Because they might not exist. So,
is there anything like that you would love to let aliens know, or let an extraterrestrial intelligence know about us?
I do think, well, maybe this is you were mentioning that you are optimistic, right? And this is probably the optimist in me. I do think we are pretty great as a species overall, and we are pretty good civilization. Regardless, of, yes, we have lots of problems as well, but that's, I guess, how you evolve. I would like to let them know that we are essentially more cooperative and more benevolent than other species, and sure that how they say, we come in peace.
Is there anything that you would tell aspiring people who are looking to get into your field? any sort of information that you think that would be worthwhile for them?
Yeah, just to be very curious, very open-minded, to look into very different fields of study. There isn't just one unique field of study. And astrobiology, for example, by itself is an interdisciplinary field. Communication by itself is an interdisciplinary field. Computational sciences are interdisciplinary, right? So right now, I don't think you can be just focused on a particular niche, and just be focused on that and disregard everything else. So we kind of have to balance our interest in a specific phenomenon. So be more focused in what kind of question you want to answer and get passionate about it, but come to it and try to answer it from very different angles and from very different points of view and from very different fields. Because even if you end up not answering the question, you will end up learning a lot in the meantime. So.
Sure. There's something that you had been thinking about since you were 6 years old, if I'm not mistaken?
I say ever since I've known myself, I've wanted to be a scientist. I didn't know what kind. I didn't know what kind because I liked so many fields. I liked everything from physics, biology, and mathematics all the way to literature and and philosophy and economics. So.
Is there anything that you are very excited about in your three fields of study that you think over the next, say, 50 years we will discover some solutions to problems?
I do think so, yes. I think that also because now it's not just one group of scientists, but we have larger teams of scientists. We have more interdisciplinary teams. Most scientists are focused now on interdisciplinary problems, and they are looking into other fields. I do think that we are more likely to find answers to some of these really difficult questions, like the origins of life, like is there life out there? Like sentience and intelligence, what exactly is it? Can we break through with our artificial intelligence algorithms into a new paradigm? I do think any of these are actually possible within the next 50 years. And it will be very interesting to witness that. It might be also very scary because with answering big questions, it's possible that we will witness some paradigm shifts in our daily lives as well. While, for example, discovering microbial life on other planets might not immediately, let's say, impact our daily lives. It's not that you will stop going to work or doing your daily routine. It will definitely change the overall outlook of our civilization, and that in time will get reflected in our daily lives as well. I think it's a pretty exciting time to be alive.
But thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great.